welcome to today's Planter Session webinar, Lessons from Mother-Daughter Church Planting, brought to you by Geneva Push. I'm your host, Ben McKecken. We're going to be joined today by some fantastic guests, Paul Harrington and Clayton Fopp, all the way from Adelaide. And Al Stewart is going to be our interviewer. Now, before I hand over to them, just a few quick things of housekeeping to let you know what's going to go on today during our webinar. But before I even get to that, let me also point out that we're recording today's session, and we're going to make the link available to you of our recording within the next couple of days. Now, what's going to happen initially, Al's going to talk to Paul and Clayton and get some great groundbreaking questions about lessons from mother-daughter church planting. And then we're going to move on to the section of the webinar where we want your questions. Feel free to send them through using the question pane, the GoToWebinar control panel question pane that's in front of you. Send the questions through. We'll put them to Paul and Clayton in about half an hour's time. Now, before we get underway, just want to thank our supporters who make every single webinar happen. Yes, we want to thank Christian Super. They're one of the driving forces behind Geneva Push's Planter Sessions. If you haven't arranged superannuation for your church plant yet, you really should start with a chat with Christian Super. It's super that is invested biblically in line with your Christian values. Go to christiansuper.com.au. And we also would love to thank EA Insurance. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side of church planting yet, then you really should have a chat with EA. They can help you sort out everything on the insurance front. Go to ea.org.au. Now, I'm going to bring Al into the conversation. Al is a director at Geneva Push. He's going to be our interviewer today. I'm going to hand over to him and get him to introduce to us Clayton and Paul. Over to you, Al.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be with you all today, and two of my good friends from Adelaide who know a lot about church planting as our guest today. Paul Harrington's been the senior minister at Holy Trinity Adelaide for, well, it's more than 20 years. I'm about to ask him exactly how long it is. And Clayton Fopp, Clayton's been on the team there for quite a while and was involved in planting the church at Trinity Mt Barker. So good morning, Paul, Clayton.
Good, Al. Good to see you.
Okay. Yep. Great to have you with us. Paul, how long is it that you've been the senior minister there at Trinity?
Since 1993.
Okay, what's that, 22 years? Okay, time goes by quickly. And Clayton, how long have you been on the team, mate?
I think I've been here for about 12 years or something now, so yeah, which seems like a long time.
Yep, only seems like a lifetime, right?
Yes.
Now, not everyone will be familiar with what's happened to Trinity over those 22 years. And I mean, of course, Paul, you're standing on the shoulders of others who've done so much hard work before you. But could you guys, one of you, whoever you'd like, kind of paint a picture of what's happened in terms of building a network of churches over those 20 or so years?
Yep, sure. So the Trinity was a pioneer church. So 1836 was when it first started meeting in Adelaide. It's located in the city. So the sort of downtown precinct, and we struggled to exist until World War II. There were, it was difficult work the whole way along. Post World War II, there was some significant growth, and then the church grew to maybe 800 or 900 people in the 1980s. And the question was, what do we do? We basically utilised the property in town as well as we could, but how do we grow from there, given that we were largely full on the site? So the two options were build a bigger building, bigger property, bigger campus in the same location, or to start thinking about church planting. So from 1993, I started talking about the idea of planting around Adelaide to reach the wider city with the gospel. And in 2001, we were able to plant our first church, which was about a 25-minute drive to the southeast of the city on the sort of freeway to Melbourne. That was Aldgate. In 2006, we planted again towards the water in a southwesterly direction. 2010, we planted twice. So one to the northeast of the city, about 25 minutes. And the same time, within a week, the plant that Clayton's involved in was started from our daughter church at the Hills, further down the freeway towards Melbourne in Mt Barker. Then in 2013, we planted another church directly south of the city at Continual Gardens, Trinity Inner South. And then this year, just a couple of months ago, Clayton here at Mt Barker, in conjunction with another of our churches at Trinity Hills, planted down at the south coast, or Victor Harbour. So we're now 7 churches, 13 congregations on 7 different locations.
Okay. Now, and so you've got a great-granddaughter church at Victor Harbour.
We have indeed.
Okay, congratulations. Quick question for you then. Quick question. Why did it take you 9 years to plant the first one, and you're planting them at least every 2 years, maybe even quicker now?
Yeah, I think we're a church that had never done it before. We're in a denominational network that didn't exactly encourage it, both because of the Adelaide context being quite liberal sort of church context, and we're evangelical, but also just because in the 90s Anglicans didn't plant in other people's parishes. That was the sort of mindset. So it took a while to get the congregation on board in terms of planting, to, I think, get us to a point where we understood why we were doing it, to reach others with the gospel, to prepare them for the flack that we'd cop, and then to actually put into place the training and the thinking behind planting the first time. So we just needed to be a bit patient because it was a big, significant change, and also I was very aware that if we didn't spend that time, didn't prepare well, if the plant struggled, the first up plant struggled, we'd probably find it really hard to back up and do it again, given our history. So trying to prepare as well as we could first up was important.
I think also there's a degree to which, as our network has grown to now 7 churches, we're actually able to do more as a network than the churches can do individually, and so I think that's also contributed to the speeding up of the planting. And as Paul mentioned, the church that we kicked off this year down at Victor Harbour, which is about an hour away from where I work in Mt Barker, it was a ministry that we started last year in preparation, but then the pastor who's actually planted it came from one of the other Trinity churches. And so that shared vision for planting within the network, I think, has helped us increase the pace in God's kindness as well.
Yeah. I think the other thing...
One is... You going, Paul? Sorry, go on.
I was just about to say, the other thing is we were keen to plant churches that planted churches. So we want that to be our DNA, as Clayton was saying. So now we're in a context where we're trying to get all 7 churches planting and thinking how they can do that on a regular basis, and then the granddaughter churches to have the same sort of mindset. So that's easier said than done, but it's certainly what we're aiming to do.
Right. So you've kind of got economies of scale. The percentage cost, if you like, of planting a new congregation, new church, is much lower when you've got 7 churches compared to that first time.
Do you mean in terms of the dollars?
Well, yes, or just in terms of effort. So giving birth that first time is really, really crucial. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Mike, if I could ask, has it worked? Have you seen the network grow? Have you seen people converted? Has it? I know we're not allowed to talk about numbers, but let's talk about people. Has it worked? Have you seen?
Sure. Yeah. Clayton, why don't you comment on what's happened here at Mt Barker? That'd be helpful.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely our experience has, I guess, been the same as what we see and what we read from around the world in terms of planting being, if not the best way, and a truly excellent way of seeing people come under the sound of the gospel. And in Mt Barker, in our 5 years, we've seen numbers of people come to faith in Christ, and perhaps what's been the surprise for us has been the significant number of people who had detached themselves from church at some point in the last 5, 10, 15 years. Seeing them connect back into church has been tremendously encouraging, and also we've been able to be an encouragement and a support to other churches in the region as well, and that's worked both ways, us to them and them to us. So at that level of both, seeing people come to Christ for the first time, as well as seeing other churches revitalised and encouraged in their gospel ministry, I think we have seen the fruit that we hoped and prayed we would see from planting.
Okay, so you've seen other churches look at what you've done and think, hey, we could have a go at this as well, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually we moved venue at Mt Barker just this year, and now there's another church from nearby planning, hoping, praying to plant, and actually looking at moving into the venue that we've just moved out of. And so we're providing as much encouragement and support as we can to them to help them realise their goal of planting a new congregation as well. And so then there'll be 2 new churches in our region, which is just terrific.
Yeah, that's right. There's room. There's room for plenty more, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Let me just push on then, Paul. Can you tell us? You've been you've stayed with the mothership there on North Terrace. What have been some of the joys and the challenges of staying in the mother church? Is it the case that it's kind of the new, sexy, exciting church plant moves out, and then the old guys are sitting there looking at each other, thinking, "Oh, here we are"?
Yeah, that's been my primary role actually. Stay home and look at the other old guys, which has been pretty exciting. The mother church has its own joys and challenges. So there's great joy in sending people. There's great joy in seeing those church plants start to flourish, reach people for Christ. I think one of the joys is seeing the ones who are sent out. They often step up. So when I visit the church plants and see people we've sent from the mother church out, and see the way in which they've jumped up a notch in terms of their leadership, their commitment to evangelism, that is pretty exciting. I think what we've learned is the first time when we planted, all the focus was on the church plant, and the mother church, we didn't really think at all much about the mission of the mother church. And so when everyone left, and we sent about somewhere between 70 and 90 people to that first church plant, when they left, the following, I reckon, 3 to 4 months, the congregation in the city just looked depressed. All their friends had gone, the energy, and a lot of the people with drive and very gifted people had picked up and put their energy into a new thing, and that alerted us to the need to be thinking much more about the sending church, whether it be the original mother church or any of the churches in our network, thinking through how the sending church prepares well and sort of recommissions its own congregation for the same sort of thing when it plants. So it's not easy. You do feel it. You can't send a significant group of people away and not feel it. But we've also experienced in the mother church the same stepping up of people. So when leaders vacate, go off and do mission elsewhere, it really means that the local people need to be stepping up and taking responsibility for the mission in the mother church. So there's new opportunities for those people to grow. And I guess one of the things we've learned over the last 15 years is how do we properly train people in the mother church to take up those roles before the people who are planting leave. That also means we can free up the planting group before they officially launch, so they prepare well too. So yeah, there's been a lot of things that have been a stretch in terms of planting from a mother church perspective, but it's overwhelmingly positive. And I think the second, third and fourth plants from the mother church, we felt much less because we had a greater sense of what was coming and were able to prepare for it much better.
Okay, so did you actually, if you've got 70 to 90 people, do you actually kind of, if you like, take them out of out of circulation or put them together before the church plant? So you give them like a, what do you call it, an incubation period or something?
Yeah, so let's say we're launching in February of a certain year. The previous 12 months, largely the person who's leading that plant will have that as the prime focus leading in. That's on a sliding scale, so the planter will pick up more and more time for the plant 12 months out, and that'll increase to full time by the time they get to the plant. The core team probably, ideally will be meeting for 9 months on a regular basis before they plant. The larger group, not necessarily the core team who are starting off, but the larger group will be going probably for 3 to 4 months. They'll start meeting and focusing on the new church plant, the roles they'll have, doing preparation. It's never as clean as that, because you've got ministry-minded people who still belong to a church, even though they're planting a new church. So normally they're pulling double duty to some degree.
Yep.
But certainly the idea is to try and dedicate a group to prepare as well as they can, and to understand where they're planting, and to dig in there as much as they can before there's any sort of public launch.
Right. Okay. But you're welding them together as a team.
Yep.
Have you found that the mother church kind of births a daughter church, or whatever you want to call it? Has the mother church regrown? Like, mum cuts an arm off and that becomes a daughter church. Does the arm regrow? Or the numbers pick up again over time, or how have you found that?
Well, the mother church, if I talk about Trinity City, is now planted 4 times. We've now got 2 other churches that we've planted who've also planted churches, so they've had their own experience in terms of numbers. But if we go to the mother church for the moment, the numbers we now have in the city are basically the same as before we first planted. So we sent out probably close to, say, 300, 350 people from the city for those plants, and we're now, so that's roughly half the original group, and that's replenished each time. It's taken different amounts of time to see that happen with each plant, but essentially we're now the same size in the city as what we were before we started.
All right, so things regrow. Yeah, okay. All right, very good, very good. Clayton, can I ask you, what's it like, can you, how would we put it, reflect on your experience about actually planting one of these daughter churches? So you're one of the guys who takes the new group. I'll ask you the same question. What have been the joys and the challenges, mate? What have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on the point that Paul's making before about how we've led up to planting, our process for planting Mt Barker in 2010 is that with that core group, a group of about 15 people, I met roughly fortnightly with them, and we looked at, basically, we prayed and prepared and planned for every element of church life together, trying to work out who are the people we're seeking to reach with the gospel of Jesus, and what Sundays would look like, and what ministries we'd have, and how we were going to connect with people, and all those kinds of things. So we met for, as I say, roughly fortnightly for a bit more than 9 months, and then at different times brought in the larger group of people who were going to be coming with us. And we had a conference in October before we planted in February that was open to anyone who was interested in coming along and being part of it. So that's kind of how that ramping up of that group of people worked. And of course, for that 9 months, they were all still involved in the church at Trinity Hills, where we were members. So they're still involved in ministry in the sending church, as well as preparing for being part of the new church. In terms of some of the joys and challenges, I guess the greatest joy is seeing people come to know Christ, and in God's kindness, we've seen that over the 5 years that we've been going in different ways. Some kind of dramatic conversions, other people who have hung around for a while, just eventually that kind of final penny drops, so to speak, and people come to trust in Jesus and understand the gospel, and that's always tremendously exciting. I think no matter how many times you see it, we're always thankful to God for that. And as I said, seeing people come back to church after maybe many years of being away. And one of the things that we found in Mt Barker, it's a fairly new area in that it's a country town, a regional centre that has become basically a dormitory suburb, huge housing subdivisions, those kinds of things. And so there's lots of people who moved into the area 5, 10, 15 years ago, had some church background perhaps, but when they moved, disconnected from church or weren't finding church to be something that equipped them for life particularly, and so they dropped out. And seeing those people connect back in is also encouraging, and see them equipped for ministry and all of those kinds of things. Some of the challenges, I guess, when you start smaller than where people came from, there's the expectation that people have of large church versus small church. We can't run everything in a small church. And so if people are used to having a whole range of programs for their kids and their teenagers and for blokes and for women, well, in a smaller church, we're just not able to do that. And so there's an expectations thing that we need to care for people in the midst of. And then, of course, expectations, if people have some church background as a youngster or previously in their adult life, they might have expectations for what church is like. The people who join us with no church background at all, well, they have a different set of expectations, or perhaps no expectations in some areas. And so trying to meet the various expectations and care for people in the midst of all of that. In the early days, of course, you've got a small group of people doing just about everything, and we needed to be quite careful that we weren't overloading people with a few key people doing all the same ministry tasks across the life of the church. I think for two reasons particularly. One is we don't want to run people into the ground. We don't want to burn people out by doing too much ministry. But also we wanted to make sure that people had time in their lives, time in their weeks, to be able to engage with non-Christian friends and to spend time with their neighbours and family in order to be able to bring light and life into those relationships. We didn't want every waking moment, every spare moment spent doing ministry tasks. And so finding that balance was something that I guess we juggled and found harder at different times. But I think it's something to bear in mind. I guess the last joy, I'd say, is seeing people with really high ownership of church and ministry, because they realise that God has used it to grow them, to draw them to Christ, or to grow them to maturity in Christ. And seeing that high ownership is kind of infectious, and people long for other people to have the benefits that they've had, and so they throw themselves into church life and ministry and evangelism, which is great to see and to watch and be a part of.
Okay, mate, there's a whole lot of things to ask about there. I've heard of people who've been involved in a church plant trying to start something, Sunday morning, family-oriented, but started with so few people that they basically flogged the willing horses to death. I've heard another man say, by the time we had the music team, the creche team, everything, there were only 3 people left in the congregation. What do you reckon is the... how many do you need to start? You need 20 people on deck, or 100, or what's your vibe on, you're going to start so let's go morning church, families, kids. How many do you need who are keen and with you?
Yeah, look, one of the things is that we're in a situation where we had a reasonably large mother church to start with. And from what I'd read, from what I'd observed, and when I talk to people, ask the questions you're asking, Al, about, what pressure, if you want to roll out sort of that ready-made church, that is, if you want to start with what people will expect for a more traditional sort of Sunday morning meeting. I don't mean traditional in terms of style, but, the expectations about music and where you meet and size. We tended to aim for 50 plus for our plans.
Okay.
So that's a fairly large group, and not everyone can do that. But I think in terms of being able to sustain it, that's in terms of the programming and everything like that, that's a good size to aim for. And most of the stats I've read and observations I've made indicate that it's very hard for new people to connect in with that sort of group until it reaches around 50. Otherwise, you feel like you're joining a smaller group and you're very vulnerable in a sense. You can't blend in because there aren't enough people to blend in with, apart from the, are there enough resources to cater for my kids, or enough kids for my kids to connect with, or those sort of issues. So we've tried to launch with groups that have been 50 plus. Clayton started with roughly that number. A couple of our plants, one of our plants started with closer to 120, but two of them started with 70 to 90. So it's varied a bit, but I think that's worth doing. Mind you, if you start with that size group, you've got to spend more time preparing and cohering the group with clarity of vision and purpose, and because it's a bigger group, you need to spend more time causing them to gel together.
Right. Okay. So maybe 50 plus. I understand what you mean. Smaller than that, it's very hard to be anonymous. So Okay.
So if you're trying to use the gathering as a place where you invite unbelievers, they will tend to feel exposed with smaller groups. And the statistics, I think, indicate that the growth that occurs under 50 is much slower than the sort of growth you might experience above 50.
Yes. In fact, I think I've seen you get your quickest growth from 50 to 150, and then you really got to push through that next growth barrier. Yes.
Yeah.
Now we're going to run. Time is going. Let me ask you then, from like you guys combined have been doing this for what, 35 years or something. Either one, can you give us maybe 3 key principles for the whole mother-daughter planting thing? Because it seems like Trinity really has worked out how to do this with God's kindness. So maybe three principles, 3 thoughts on what should we learn?
Yep. Okay. I'll start. Number one, I reckon, in terms of this model, choose which DNA you want to transplant from the mother church. Richard Harris, who's on the North American Mission Board, says, besides God himself, the greatest resource for church planting is the mother church. And we've definitely found that to be the case in our experience. And when the mother church is healthy, this mother-daughter church planting model allows a good, healthy DNA to be easily transplanted into the new church. Of course, the question is, well, which DNA do you want to plant? And that's what we need to think about. For us, of course, we want to say there's first level things, the uniqueness of Jesus, the centrality of word ministry in the life of the church, but also even for second or third order things. So for us at Trinity, being part of a network that is committed to planting more churches. Almost everyone that we started with was on board with those kinds of things. We weren't trying to negotiate with our first group of people what kind of church are we going to be. Do we want to plant churches, or do we want to grow a single congregation mega church? We'd already taken that part of the DNA. The way that we did that was through spending lots of time in the Bible together in that 9 months prior to launching, and we wrote some Bible studies that were particularly designed to teach and implant our DNA, our biblical way of thinking about church. And anyone who joined us heard the gospel repeatedly and learned what we are on about. And of course, one of the advantages as well is that if you plant with a group of people who you've trained and worked with before, then you have a high degree of confidence that they are on board with the important things, the key things that are important for the church. And so if you choose which bits of the DNA that you're going to plant, your vision for church is already both widely and deeply held from the moment that you kick off. I'd say the second thing then is once you've chosen which of your DNA you want to plant, choose everything else based on your mission. What is going to connect with the people that you're trying to reach with the gospel of Jesus? And so I wanted to encourage people to think like a non-Christian, to think, what are my friends going to think and feel when they turn up? And so the shape of Sundays and how we structure things and what ministries we provide and what's going to happen before, during and after the service, we wanted to choose those things based not on our tradition or necessarily what was happening in the mother church, but on what we thought was going to connect best with non-Christians, with people who needed to hear the gospel. And we had some worksheets and stuff that we sent out to our key people. We sent them into a place that we called a secular church, like a pub or the TAB or to IKEA or to a play cafe, somewhere where they maybe hadn't been before, somewhere they were unfamiliar, for them to have that experience of not knowing, where do I stand, where do I go in, what do I wear, what are the languages, the language and the practices that everyone else seems to understand that I don't. And we found that just that experience for our starter group and our core team was really helpful in getting people to understand what it's like for a newcomer to turn up on Sundays. We got people to think about their neighbourhoods, to think about who are the people who are around, and then a spiritual profile, which I think we kind of took out of Tim Keller's Centre Church, thinking about what are the obstacles to these people coming to understand the gospel of Jesus. How do they think about things? What's their worldview? What defeated beliefs are we going to have to address in order for them to best hear the gospel and respond to Jesus? And so we didn't want to take any kind of structural stuff or outward stuff simply because it was done in the sending church. We wanted to decide those kinds of things based on the people we're trying to reach with the gospel. And the third principle, I think, that we have learnt, and in some ways maybe with this one we've learnt the harder way, perhaps compared to the other two, is that you always plant twice. That is, we always need to be mindful of the mission of the mother church, both leading up to and in the days and weeks and months after the plant. There is a reflexive benefit for the mother church in planting, in that there can be, if we make the most of it, opportunities to heighten evangelism, to heighten training, to create new opportunities for people to grow and to serve. And when Keller talks about church planting as having the effect of continual corporate renewal and revival of existing churches, I think this is part of what he means by that. So if we take 5 Bible study group leaders to plant a new church, well, there's an opportunity for 5 more people in the mother church to be trained up in the weeks and months prior and to step into those roles that are created. And when the core team for the church plant or the starter group for the church plant are praying for their non-Christian friends, the rest of the sending church are hearing about that and thinking, well, who can I be praying for in this same kind of deliberate way? So planting puts mission and evangelism very much on the agenda for the church, and when that new church is planted, it gives the mother church, those in the mother church, the opportunity to think, well, what next? How do we keep working towards the rapid spread of the gospel? And planting, sending people, training up people and sending them out helps keep the mother church, the sending church, in a healthy kind of position. As I say, I think we probably found that one harder to maintain than the other two, and maybe Paul has some thoughts about that one particularly.
Okay. Now, Paul, have you got thoughts? We don't have a lot of time, so I'm keen to get to questions from people who are listening in.
Yeah, sure.
But mate, 20 years of doing this, what can you distill down some gold? Is what we want, mate. Gold.
I reckon you ought to plan, prepare, and pray more than you think you have to. So a lot of church planting can come adrift because people rush into it too quickly. And what they find is once they've launched, they're doing a whole lot of the planning, preparation and organising that they should have done before they planted once they start. And that drains the energy from being able to do the frontline evangelism and reaching new people with the gospel. So plan, prepare, pray more than you think you have to. I'd reinforce Clayton's point about the mother church needing to have a strategy for, you know, gospel growth and progress of the gospel. So mother church needs to think through that. I think one of the important things to do is make sure there's real clarity of relationship between the mother church and the daughter church. When you plant with a mother-daughter model, it's highly relational, and therefore everyone thinks we all know what we mean by what's going to happen and the ongoing relationship between the two. But without clarity, without actually specifying what that looks like, what are the responsibilities, how the finances work, where are the lines of authority, those sorts of things, they don't need to be a problem. But if you don't talk about them and clarify them, there's a good chance they will be a problem. So get it sorted early on, even if it changes over time. They'd be a couple of the things that I think are worth thinking about.
Okay, because there's a built-in problem that everyone who joins the daughter church doesn't know who the mother churches are.
Yeah, that's right.
And once you get to great-granddaughter churches, who's Holy Trinity City? What's that? So, yeah.
What we've done here in Adelaide is we've established a network identity which is apart from the mother church. And so people are actually aware, even if they join one of the daughter churches, that they're actually joining a network of churches. So not a relationship to a mother church, rather a relationship to a network of people doing the same sort of task around Adelaide. I think that's been a helpful reorientation for us, and it's much healthier.
Right, so what do you call that? Are you just a Trinity network or something? What do you call that?
Yeah, that's right. We're a Trinity network of churches, and people who join one of our 7 churches belong to that.
Okay, very good. Let me, there's a whole lot of questions I'd like to ask, but let me ask you some that have come through from people listening. Question from Chris. Does the mother or the network finance the plant? So where's the money come from?
It probably comes in a few different directions. The mother church finances the plant by virtue of sending the people who finance the plant. So there's a big cost that's borne by the mother church for the daughter church. So that's one factor, and a significant factor. So when people go, their wallets go, their giving goes to the new church. We've also established a network structure or framework where all the churches are committed to new plants, and that involves a commitment financially as well. So it's an all for one, one for all sort of principle, and we know that the church plants are going to, the ones that are launched are going to be the ones under financial pressure. So we do pitch in different ways to help the daughter churches when they start, so they don't feel the stress of finances by themselves. So it's a bit of both. With the new South Coast plant we've just launched this year, 2 of our churches have particularly pledged money for that new church, and they were the ones that were most closely associated with sending them. So Trinity Mt Barker and Trinity Hills both committed finances to support that, especially in the first year.
Okay, so you kind of, cross-subsidised, work together with that. Okay.
Yeah,
yep. And of course, the new church plan, when it's 1 in 7, is a different financial model to when it's the original mother church planting a first church. It's as a percentage-wise, each new church plant becomes a smaller incremental step, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the trouble is, anyone listening who's planted churches knows this, but every church planter has ambitious goals for their church. Yep. And so you've always got this tension between wanting to progress the gospel in your location, which costs money, as well as wanting to support the work of the gospel progressing elsewhere, which also costs money. So there is that sort of tension, and I think that's a really healthy tension. But you're right. Once you've got 7 churches, or if it grows, the percentage cost comes down, and the level of, I guess, expertise around that hopefully increases too.
Yes, yes, and the level of complexity. Here's another question from Peter. What are the differences between doing a church plant and doing a church transplant, where you take a ready-made congregation from the parent church? Do you want to read that again? So there's a church plant versus a transplant where you pick up an existing congregation and put it down somewhere else. Differences?
I guess one of the one difference may well be the reason that it's happening, and so there may be a reason, a resources reason, a space reason, a size reason, where a congregation needs to move from one place to another, and even at Trinity City, we've moved congregations off-site for periods of time for reasons of space and those kinds of things. I think perhaps the biggest challenge with taking a ready-made congregation, yes, you absolutely get all of that Mother Church DNA that I was talking about, but what might be harder in that context is to make decisions about everything else based on the mission. That if the identity is just, it was formerly part of Church X and now we're moving it to a new suburb or whatever, perhaps the understanding of who are the people that we're seeking to reach and what are the unique gospel challenges of this particular part of the world, what objections do people here have to the gospel of Jesus that maybe aren't really on the radar screen for people where the congregation has come from. To me, that sounds like a challenge to that model, not an insurmountable challenge by any stretch. And there are certainly churches who are doing good work in that kind of transplant. But that to me would sound like something we'd need to be very careful about and need to give significant thought to. How do we, if you like, indigenize the mission of this congregation?
Yes, you transplant a congregation, you don't start with the same clean slate, do you?
And one of the advantages of a church plant is that other than those core DNA things that you decide on, everything else is up for grabs. When we started, I said to our people, in our Sunday gatherings, we will read the Bible and have it explained, we will pray, and there'll probably be something to do with music. Now, everything else around that, including what those 3 things look like, we're up for grabs based on our mission. Now, as it happens, it does look remarkably like the sending church at Trinity Hills. But that's because we're only 14 minutes door-to-door from where they meet.
Yeah.
But it was interesting when the city church planted the Hills, there was a discussion about whether the pastor of the new church plant meeting in a 1950s concrete block building would wear his robes, because in the Anglican church that was the mother church, that's what he wore on Sunday mornings. But new church is much easier. It's easier to make changes, to ditch things that we don't think are helping us communicate the gospel effectively to people. That transplanting idea perhaps makes those sorts of things harder.
Okay. The last thing we need is me ranting about robes. So let's go to the next question. I'm not going near it. I'm letting it go. Thanks, Clayton. Here we go. Steve asks, oh yeah, this is a thorny one. What difference would it make to your approach if the planting group had a significant proportion of people from other churches? So people who join you from other churches, other kind of traditions, other denominations, has that brought particular challenges or opportunities?
Yeah, well, our most recent plant, so the one at Victor Harbour, which is about an hour away from us in Mt Barker, we started with, it was a different model, and we started with really one family from Trinity Mt Barker who had been driving up to church every week from down there. And we started with them, and we put together a Bible study group, and we grew that into 2, sometimes 3 adult Bible study groups, as well as a high school age youth group and a kids program, and we ran that for about 9 months last year, and that was the growing phase of growing towards a church plant, but with only that one family who had history with us at Trinity. And throughout the times of Bible study, other people joined, and so by the end of the year, there was about 40-something adults and kids there, and we ran that on a Sunday evening. Now, what we did with that group was we put together a series of Bible studies that were completely intended to share with people what we thought we were on about. So the heart of the gospel, what church is, God's heart for lost people, the things that we thought were non-negotiable. And then around those things, we talked about some other things that we thought were negotiable. And we had some all-in times where we talked about the practicalities of evangelism and mission in the local area. But in terms of getting everyone on the same page, we had 20 sessions in the Bible together, looking at what God's Word says about grace and justification and scripture and money and church and worship and a whole bunch of things like that, embedding that DNA, if you like. And so all of these 40-something people who had little or no history with us at Trinity previously were able by the end of that time to say, I know what these guys are on about, and they were able to decide, yes, we want to be part of this church plant. We can commit to the things that these guys think are important, and we share this same vision for seeing lost people in our region come to know the gospel.
So, Clayton, when did you do that, though? That's not in your kind of public Sunday meeting, is it? Was that a midweek meeting or something? When?
So what we did was we ran these multiple Bible study groups Sunday evenings, and they were public in the sense that anyone was welcome to turn up, and people did invite their friends, which is how we went from one family to 40 or so people. But it wasn't. There was no signs out and those kinds of things. So it was all word of mouth, people inviting their friends, and so it was just at that level, just Bible study groups, and we met together and we read the scriptures and we studied God's Word, and as I say, a few times throughout the year we had a broader all-in session which had some training and some of the bigger picture stuff about thinking how do we engage people in this region with the gospel.
Right. Okay, so you took your time, you did it right. I've got a question from, we've got about 10 minutes left, but a question from Tim. What's the organisation support structure behind the network? How do the lines of authority and responsibility work?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that's evolved over time, so it's changed as we've planted more churches. The current structure is essentially that we have a network identity where we have a board, and the board makes some overarching decisions for the network on things like policy and governance. Its primary job, this board for the network, is to drive the church planting agenda and to support it and make sure it happens. Each of the churches has their own leadership team, the team that thinks about ministry in that particular location, headed up by the pastor of that particular church. So the idea is that the board tries to take responsibility for things that will distract from doing ministry on the ground, and some of that is background organisational stuff, infrastructure stuff, finance stuff to provide, backroom backup for how those things are worked out, and to free the local team to make decisions and to pray and to think about how to implement ministry initiatives on the ground and to do that people stuff. So there's that sort of, that's the general framework. I've been sort of set apart substantially to work with the senior pastors in the network to support and encourage them and to help them swap ideas and to benefit from what each of them is doing. The leadership teams, I don't think we've done this particularly well, but our aim is to try and work out how to give them clarity on what they're doing at the local level and to encourage them and to think about how they also have a level of, you know, cross-fertilisation. We're starting to explore that a bit more. So that's the essential structure, a network structure that's not designed to make local ministry decisions, but to provide frameworks, and then the local leadership team structure that operates like most leadership teams do in a local church to drive the ministry there.
And do you have kind of centralised payroll, banking, bookkeeping, that financial legal administration is done centrally for the 7 churches?
Yeah, that's what we do. What we have is a situation where each of the churches have and take responsibility for a local budget, but we try and provide the backroom stuff on finance and that sort of thing to help make that work really smoothly. So we don't have 7 people doing payroll. We have one person who essentially does that for everybody and provides some expertise and you know, the sort of systems that actually help that work well.
Yes, okay, and get economies of scale. Question from Alan. Is it better to wait for the perfect time or just start praying and planning and go when you sense the Lord's timing might have arrived? So how do you know when it's time to plant a church, Paul?
It's always time to plant a church, I think. So that is, when I think about Adelaide or South Australia, we desperately need, I think, hundreds more church plants. So it's always good to be planting and to be planning to plant. I think the question is, like the questions raised, do you start praying? Absolutely. Do you start planning? Yes. The only issue is, when do you go? That is, when do you, when do you actually decide to do it? And that may depend on a whole range of factors. You know, are you able to assemble a core team to go with you to do it? Do you have clarity on the mission of the place where you're going to? There are a whole lot of those sort of factors. So, yeah, but the basic line is, yes, plant, and then the only question is when and how. That needs working through with other people, I think.
Okay. Now here's a tricky one. And remember, Paul, it's not as if we're speaking to the whole world. This is just going out on the internet. It's about planting in different denominations. I remember you saying in your particular denomination, every blade of grass in Australia is in someone's parish, and so you've got to plant into it. So Richard asks, how could this work in a Presbyterian context? Now you're in the Anglican. Do you know enough about Presbyterianism to comment? How could this work in a Presbyterian context?
I can speak with enormous ignorance on this one.
Go for it then.
So I don't know the structure for the Presbyterian Church. The Anglican Church, as you say, is a farm system essentially. Everyone's got a farm. You cross over the fence, you get shot. That's
in love. In love.
Yeah, of course. Clubbed to death and then shot. So us planting in Adelaide, especially beyond what was seen to be our patch, was a point of tension and continues to be a point of tension in terms of the way we do it. What we tried to do is to talk openly and regularly and in advance to those who are involved in denominational leadership, so we never take them by surprise. If we're thinking about planting in a certain area, we try and talk to all the church leaders in that area well in advance, so they've got some sense of what we're planning, able to ask questions and engage us before we do that. So I think part of it is, if you've got a gospel-minded denomination, you would expect the pastors of gospel-minded churches to be keen for new gospel work to happen in their patch. So I think the first thing to say is, can you work with the structure to actually help that denomination own your plans for planting? If that can't be achieved, you're then probably in a situation where you need to work out, well, how can we get on with gospel work when the structures aren't enhancing that possibility? Sometimes that does mean stretching boundaries, and that can be uncomfortable. So we've, as I say, had a level of denominational tension surrounding our planting, even though we've worked hard in communication and connecting with people. Now we've done it over a 12-year period. People can see that planting churches actually, it contributes to the whole gene pool of gospel work in an area, and so they don't fear it as much as they used to. They're not as worried about their patch, I think. So sometimes getting going is one of the hardest things to do, I reckon.
Right. So there may well come a time, though, if you wait for everyone to be happy with you and all green lights, it'll never happen. Would that be fair?
Well, everyone has never been happy with anything we've ever done. So, yeah, we've never had green lights right across the board. There've always been flashing lights in a number of spots as we've planted, and we just try to be gracious, listen to what people said, work out what we should be doing, and keep being caring for the people in the area.
Yeah, it's a pity you can't be on everyone's Christmas card list at the same time. It's yeah.
Strange.
Yeah. Now, it's very interesting talking with you both. We've got just a few minutes left. We'll have people listening who are senior ministers in churches and could potentially work towards this mother-daughter planting. Others, maybe younger guys who are thinking about being a planter in this context. Have you got anything you'd want to say about encouraging people to keep pushing towards this, about that it's worthwhile? Anything to say in terms of encouragement around the country?
The Mother Church, when we first started talking about church planting, there was a fairly high level of resistance to the idea from the members in the congregation, which is partially why it took a while to get to the first plant. However, the people who are part of that Mother Church have been, stayed the distance. We've had lots of change, we've sent lots of people, but I think at this point in time, that Mother Church owns the fact that we plant, and they're delighted that we are. So, and I think that Mother Church is much healthier now, evangelistically and in other ways, than what it was 15 years ago, because we've engaged in this sort of enterprise. So for a church to be on the front foot thinking about evangelism, and an expression of that being planting, so healthy church planting healthy churches, is actually good. I mean, it's good for the kingdom, but it's actually good for the Mother Church. And I think that that's well owned by our Mother Church at this stage. Yeah, Clayton?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of guys doing planting around the place with lots of different models, and this kind of mother-daughter model isn't going to work in every context. And particularly for us, it's worked where we've had large-ish numbers of people already living in a particular area, and so that's obviously a key factor. But I mean, I would echo that a little quote from Richard Harris that I mentioned earlier. Besides God himself, the greatest resource for church planting is the Mother Church, and we've seen God work, greatly through the this model of planting, and it's helped us significantly. It's enabled us to plant probably at a rate that we wouldn't have been able to do other ways, and see connection with numbers of people we wouldn't have been able to see in other ways. And so I think there's a lot to be thankful for, a lot to commend this mother mother-daughter model, that recognising that it's not the only way of starting new churches and congregations.
Okay, very exciting, and it's been great to see what's happened, what God's done in Adelaide over many years as we've watched from interstate. Thanks for being with us, Paul, Clayton, much appreciated, and I'm going to hand back now to Ben, who will close our session.
Thanks,
Al.
Thanks so much, Al, Clayton, Paul. That was fantastic, wasn't it? I'm sure you've enjoyed being part of today's planter session as much as I have. As I mentioned at the start, before Clayton and Paul and Al gave us so much information about mother-daughter church planting, that we have been recording today's session, and we will be sending an email out to all of you to let you know when it is available, not just so you can go back over and jot down all the notes that you may have missed, but so you can share it with as many people that you know are interested in this excellent topic of mother and daughter church planting. Now, before we sign off today, I just want to quickly point you to our next webinar. It's coming up on the 5th of August. It's going to be on the subject of the A to Z of assessment. So Mikey Lynch is going to be interviewing Geneva Pushers, Scott Sanders and Greg Lee, and they're going to be diving into all the nuts and bolts, the ins and outs of the Geneva assessment process, what you can expect during it, and just how Geneva can help you get involved with church planting. Now, before I sign off, I want to quickly thank again our sponsors for today's webinar. Thank you so much to EA Insurance and Christian Super. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side or the Christian or the super side of church planting, head to Christian Super. Go to EA Insurance for more information. My name is Ben McKecken. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward for you joining us at the next webinar on the 5th of August, the A to Z of assessment. To register, go to genevapush.com. Have a fantastic day.